Grade 11, we're continuing our talk about the gender typing and or the assignment of certain characteristics or certain jobs according to the sex. Psychological note that gender identity begins developing before the age of 3. Thus, at the same time as youngsters are developing their ideas about what it is to be a man or woman in our society, advertising is competing with parents and school to influence them. To what extent does advertisement simply provide young consumers information about products designed for them? They push the girls to wear pink. They push the boys never to wear pink. They push the girls to play with dolls. They push the boys to always play with cars. This is mainly advertising, and this is mainly what the society is doing to you more than what your sex or gender is doing to you and what you're supposed to be or do according to your sex. Several different theories have been proposed to explain the gender role development, which is also known as the gender typing. Okay, we start with the biological view, and then we're going to talk about the psychological view. Genetically, first of all, in the biological view, we're going to talk about the genetic. The genetic theory has been adjusted as anthropologists have found new evidence about prehistoric societies. The evidence indicates that ancient gender roles may not have been as rigid as scholars once supposed. For instance, men and women probably shared responsibilities for farming, hunting, and child rearing. In any case, according to the theory, genes that produce behaviors that improve survival would have been passed on to future generations, and those behaviors would eventually come to characteristic humans as species. The genetic view of gender role origins is on the whole controversial. You cannot say that she's supposed to act this way because she's a woman. It is not written in the genetics. It's just an idea. Hormones. Some psychologists believe that gender typing occurs because men and women differ in the organization and functioning of their brain. According to this view, sex hormones sculpt the brains of men and women differently before birth. Okay, so you know that the brain is formed of two hemispheres, right and left sides of the brain, and they are somewhat specialized to carry out different functions. The majority of the cognitive functions are performed by both hemispheres. However, they are performed more quickly and efficiently by one hemisphere than the other. In most people, the right hemisphere is better at performing visual spatial tasks, whereas the left hemisphere is better at verbal tasks. Producing speech is one of the few cognitive tasks that are the sole responsibility of one hemisphere or the other. This specialization of the two sides of the brain is called lateralization. There is some evidence to suggest that testosterone levels lead to relatively greater growth of the right hemisphere as compared to the left hemisphere. So, when we say that the right hemisphere is responsible for visual spatial tasks, whereas the left hemisphere is better at verbal tasks, and then we say that the testosterone increases the growth of the right hemisphere, this evidence is consistent with research indicating that females tend to show less lateralization than men. Taken together, these studies could help explain why males seem to be better at visual spatial tasks, which tend to be processed by the right hemisphere, and why females seem to be better at verbal tasks, which tend to be processed by the left hemisphere of the brain. There are also the psychological views. The first part of the psychological view includes the psychoanalytic theory. The psychoanalytic theory, of course, was done by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theory argues that gender typing can be explained in terms of gender identification, which occurs between the ages of 3 and 5. In the beginning of this period, Freud argued that children seek the attention of the parent of the opposite sex and perceive the parent of the same sex as a rival for their attention. By the end of this period, however, children no longer feel this way and instead identify with the parent of the same sex. According to Freud, it is through this process of identification with the same-sex parent that a child comes to develop the behaviors that are associated with his or her own sex. The child internalizes the standards of the same-sex parent and eventually adopts that parent as a role model for behavior. There is also the social learning theory. According to the social learning theory, the gender role behavior, like other behavior, is acquired through different learning processes, reinforcement and modeling. Social learning theories argue that reinforcement of appropriate gender role behavior starts very early, almost from the moment of birth. The way babies are treated may depend on their sex. When children are old enough to understand language, parents and others begin to instruct them about how they are expected to behave. Parents tend to talk and read more to baby girls. For example, the fathers they often engage in more rough and tumble play with boys. Even in the absence of reinforcement and social learning can occur through observation and imitation of others. This process is known as modeling. Children learn about both male and female gender role behavior by observing males and females with whom they commonly interact. However, the children are more likely to model or imitate individuals of the same sex as themselves, particularly a parent of the same sex. The gender schema theory. Social learning theory has made important contributions to our understanding of how reinforcement and modeling promote gender-typed behavior. A somewhat different view of the gender typing is provided by the gender schema theory. According to this theory, children themselves play an active role in developing gender-appropriate behavior. Children form their own concepts about gender and then shape their behavior so that it conforms with their gender concepts. A gender schema is a cluster of ideas about physical qualities, behaviors, personality traits associated with one sex than the other. The theory holds that gender is such a strong force in our society that children come to organize their perceptions along gender lines. The gender schema theory suggests as soon as children learn whether they are boys or girls, they begin to seek the information concerning gender-type traits. Even very young children start to mentally group people of the same sex according to the traits they believe are representative of that gender. Regardless of how gender typing occurs, perhaps it should not be viewed as inevitable. While most human societies have found it appropriate for males and females to have different roles, many people today believe that strict gender roles no longer suit our basic values or our way of life. As I said before, it's not the 1920s anymore. Your gender does not define what you can or cannot do. Your physical properties, your psychological properties are the ones that are going to define this, and what's really going to define this, what you really want to do. This is why these days there are variations in the gender roles. And there are variations in the gender roles, there are exchanging in the gender roles, there are changing in the work preferences, there are changes in everything concerning gender roling and gender typing. That's all with the gender roles, and this is your chapter 16 in your book.